Welcome to the next installment in my video lecture series in economics. And in this particular video lecture, we're going to be taking a look at efficiency from the perspective of a single market. So we're only looking at one particular market, the efficiency in that particular market. We're not looking at this in a general equilibrium sense. And this is from my public finance course and it relates to the section on market efficiency. So it's useful for students to think of this as follows. All right, when we're talking about marginal benefit and marginal cost, students should think of supply as the marginal cost and demand as the marginal benefit. From the demand perspective, as individuals consume more of that particular item, the demand curve replicates the benefits that individuals are getting from those items. So, and we can similarly look at the supply curve from that perspective. As a supply curve, as we follow it, the cost of production is increasing, so the marginal cost is going up. So let's take a look at a market and just do a very simple review of this. So we have our downward sloping demand curve, which is representing marginal benefit. And we have our supply curve, which is representing marginal cost. And the equilibrium is where supply and demand equal one another, and that gives us the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. If we have production and consumption in this market that's greater than the equilibrium output, say Q1, which is greater than the equilibrium quantity, we can see we have a marginal benefit here. And if we can continue up from Q1 up to the supply curve and across, that gives us our marginal cost. As you can see here, marginal cost is greater than marginal benefit. So individuals are purchasing items at a higher price than the benefit than they are actually receiving. So for a numeric example, let's say they are spending $12 for something that only gives them $10 worth of benefits. So for every single output above QE, so from QE to Q1, for every single one of these units of consumption, marginal cost is greater than marginal benefit. So that is inefficient, where efficiency is going to be where marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit. All right, so once we get to production and consumption past the equilibrium, we are getting into an area of inefficiency because on the margin it's more costly than the benefit that is being derived by the consumers of that particular product. We can also look at this from the perspective of underproduction. So we have Q1, which is less than the equilibrium output level. So if we go from Q1 up to the supply curve and across, we have marginal cost for that particular output, Q1 for Q1. And if we go from Q1 up to the demand curve and across, that gives us marginal benefit. So we can see at an output less than the equilibrium output, we see that marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost. So individuals are deriving benefit greater than the cost of purchasing that particular item. So let's say they are getting $12 of benefit for something that costs $10 to purchase. So in this area below, where output is below the equilibrium output level, we can see that marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost. And for every unit from Q1 to QE, that is going to be the case. That if production and consumption continues to increase, marginal benefit is going to be greater than marginal cost. So we should continue producing and consuming those items until we get to QE. Now, to look at this from a visual perspective, the way efficiency is oftentimes measured is the level of total surplus, which is just consumer surplus, and adding that to producer surplus. So total surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus. We add those together and that gives us the total surplus in the marketplace. So for this to be useful, let's take a look at the underproduction and overproduction examples and see what happens to total surplus. So under our assumptions, the market equilibrium is the efficient outcome because of the fact that total surplus, consumer surplus, and producer surplus are at a maximum here. So let's take a look at an output and consumption level that is less than QE. So we go from Q1 up to the supply curve, and we go further up to the demand curve, and we can see here that marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost. So as we stated previously, we should increase production and consumption from Q1 to QE until marginal benefit and marginal cost are equal to one another. So these two shaded areas give us the total surplus when we are at a market equilibrium, where we're at the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Now we're imposing a condition where the output and consumption is less than the equilibrium. Let's take a look at what happens to total surplus, consumer surplus, and producer surplus. Those two shaded triangles here, this one and this one, are no longer total surplus. The reason being is they're not being produced and they're not being consumed. If they're not being produced and they're not being consumed, they are not generating producer surplus and consumer surplus. So if we were at the equilibrium, this would be the total surplus would be this large triangle here, going from the origin to the equilibrium and then following up the demand curve. But because production is below the equilibrium level, we have a lower level of total surplus, and it's measured by the two triangles that we have right here. If we were at the equilibrium quantity and price, this would be consumer surplus and this would be producer surplus, and we would see that total surplus would be higher at the equilibrium price and quantity than at the Q1 that we imposed, the condition that we imposed upon this particular market. So you can see here that we have a lower total surplus at Q1 than we have at QE. The difference being these two unshaded areas right here. We could take a look at this from the perspective of overproduction. So we have Q1, we follow that up to the demand curve. We continue all the way up until we hit the supply curve. And then we can see for Q1 that the marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefit. So for every unit produced and consumed from QE to Q1, this is the case. It's costing more on the margin than the benefits that it's generating on the margin. So for these levels of consumption, we're actually reducing total surplus. Here is the total surplus if we were at the equilibrium. So we have consumer surplus, producer surplus. Those together give us total surplus. When we get into production and consumption past QE, we're actually causing negative total surplus because the marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefit. So those two triangles right there are the loss in total surplus that occurs by overproduction. So in this marketplace, the total surplus would be the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus, and then we would subtract off this amount because of the fact that for all of these items that are being produced from QE to Q1, the marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefit. So this is actually, the consumption here is detracting from efficiency. It's decreasing total surplus. So hopefully this helps you understand efficiency from the perspective of a single market, why the equilibrium is considered to be efficient based upon total surplus, consumer surplus plus producer surplus, and why if we produce more than that, overproduction, this decreases total surplus, and if we have underproduction relative to the equilibrium, we have a lower level of total surplus. So indicating that the equilibrium outcome in the market is the efficient outcome in the market.